Dr. Lena Morris liked to think of the Earth as a slow-breathing animal, its ribs rising and falling once every few centuries. Her job at the Pacific Northwest Seismic Laboratory was to hold a stethoscope to those ribs and write down the heartbeat. On an overcast Tuesday in March, the heartbeat spoke back. At 9:16 a.m., a magnitude 6.2 quake rattled the outer edge of the Cascadia subduction zone. The shaking was sharp but short, enough to knock coffee mugs from desks and split the plaster in older downtown buildings. Lena's workstation lit up with scrolling waveforms. She and her graduate assistant, Thomas Reyes, spent the morning triaging the data tagging arrivals of P waves, then S waves, then surface waves, and updating the state emergency office with provisional epicenter coordinates. Shortly after noon, Thomas wandered off for fresh batteries, leaving Lena alone with the data stream. Out of habit, she executed a small side project, converting a segment of raw seismograph readings into audio. Years earlier, she had written a Python script for public outreach events, compressing the low-frequency quake signals up into a range that the human ear could register. An eerie metallic groan that elementary school kids loved to call the Earth's roar. She clicked play, expecting the usual subterranean growl. What emerged instead was a whisper riding in the static, so quick she almost dismissed it as a software glitch. 4 hours, 5 minutes, 17 seconds. Lena froze. The syllables were clipped and breathy, as though someone had inhaled too late to finish each word. She replayed the clip. Again the numbers floated in the hiss, followed by a final, almost polite directive: prepare. She checked the data file path. It wasn't a mislabeled audio log. It was definitely the converting of an uncorrupted seismic trace. Maybe an online radio station had bled into the speakers? She unplugged her headphones and replayed the file through the lab's external monitor. The whisper remained. 4 hours, 5 minutes, 17 seconds. Something primitive tightened in her throat, the stiffening one feels when a hunting dog stares at empty hallway toys, recoiling from shadows adults are too dull to see. She opened the USGS aftershock probability tool, which predicted a 27% chance of an aftershock above magnitude 5 in the next 7 days. The model offered no narrower window than that, but her whisper had given one exactly 4:21 and 17 seconds p.m. She typed a note to Thomas, felt ridiculous, deleted it. She wrote a fresh note to herself. Anomalous audio artifact, possible pareidolia, possible sabotage by ham radio operator. She printed the waveform anyway, taped it to her monitor, and set an alarm. At 4:21 p.m., Lena looked up from a spreadsheet. The fluorescent lights overhead swayed. The floor thumped once, twice, then rolled like a bellboy returning to center. The shaking lasted 26 seconds. Magnitude 5.5, epicenter 10 kilometers north of the morning quake. Her alarm shrilled 3 tables away, announcing that 4 hours, 5 minutes, and 17 seconds had elapsed. When Thomas stormed in with a snack bag tucked under his arm, Lena's hands were clenched around the edges of her chair. "Did you feel that?" he asked, cheeks flushed with excitement. "They'll have to update the hazard maps again." She clicked off the alarm. "Yeah," she said calmly. "I felt it." That night, she lay awake replaying the whisper on a loop until the headphone cups warmed against her ears. Eventually, she fell asleep, the sibilant digits still counting down behind her eyelids. 2 days later, during a lull between data entries, she pulled the entire seismic record since the main shock into a new workspace. She filtered everything above 10 Hz, then ran the same pitch shift script over the result. A chorus emerged, multiple voices weaving through the static like a crowd whispering inside a marble corridor. She isolated spikes, where the spectrogram showed unnaturally sharp formants and Schumann vowels birthed inside geologic noise. 12 hours, 59 minutes. South Pier. Midnight. "The water will climb, Lena." Her name slid through the channel with intimate, confessional gravity. She felt color leave her face. Thomas noticed. "You look seasick," he said. "Want me to grab you a ginger ale?" "I'm fine," she replied. "Just need fresh air." Outside the lab, slate clouds pressed low, smelling of crushed cedar. She walked the perimeter twice before returning to her desk. half convinced the fresh air would scrub the hallucination from her ears. It didn't. When she sat down, the speakers emitted a single pop, as though someone had just yanked out a microphone jack, and then settled into ordinary silence, ever so respectful. Lena cued the time-coded voice for midnight, "The water will climb," and pulled up tidal predictions. The nearest tide gauge was at Elliott Bay. Peak high tide was set for 12:08 a.m. EM. She transferred the voice file to her phone and drove out to the shoreline just before midnight, telling herself she was simply testing an obsession so it could be debunked and put away. The marina parking lot was nearly empty, the water flat under sodium vapor lamps. She waited in her car, engine idling. At 12:05 a.m. her phone buzzed an alarm. At 12:05 IUMM, her phone buzzed an alarm. She stepped onto the dock. The pilings groaned, though no wind stirred. A dull clank of metal reached her ear, mooring lines tightening simultaneously. 30 seconds later, a mild but perceptible jolt rippled through the dock, like something massive had bumped the seafloor. A magnitude 4.1 quake registered on her phone's early warning app. Epicenter just offshore. Depth 22 kilometers. The energy was modest, but it generated a localized surge that lifted the marina 20 centimeters. Enough to test the knotwork of rookie sailors. Enough to hush the gulls. "The water will climb," the whisperer had said. Not a catastrophic tsunami, just proof of prophecy, clerical in its precision. Driving back, Lena's steering wheel felt greasy with sweat. A rational mind organizes error first. If findings are impossible, start cataloging mistakes until one fits. She replayed the procedures. Instrument calibration, file integrity, file check time codes. Everything was normal. She needed a sanity echo, so she called Thomas from the highway. "Sorry for the hour," she began, "but I think I've got something weird. Do you remember my audio script? The one you run for fourth graders? Yeah. I've been hearing voices, predicting aftershocks. They're accurate within seconds." She heard him draw in air, assess, choose caution. "Could you send me the files?" "Yes, but don't listen alone," she blurted before realizing how that sounded. When she pulled into her apartment garage, he had already replied with a wave emoji and the words, "On it." She slept badly again, bracing for the phone to ring with his verdict. It rang at 3:11 a.m. "Jesus, Lena." Thomas's voice was watery with sleeplessness. "That 4-hour prediction, is that real?" "Yes. I ran a spectrum analysis. Those consonants aren't artifacts. And there's phase coherence across 3 separate stations. That means the voices are embedded in the wave itself." His statement felt like a knuckle against her temple, a tiny, precise pain signifying deeper trauma. "What do we do?" he asked. "Document," she said, "and keep it quiet until we understand." But she knew neither of them possessed the patient secrecy required. By Friday, they had identified 37 distinct messages embedded in the first quake's coda waves. 26 had already come to pass. Minor aftershocks, rock slides onto deserted Forest Service roads, a leaking gas main on Hill Street that fire crews had contained before dawn. Every message adhered to a pattern, a timestamp, a location cue, and a verb. Each event had occurred within a 2-minute window of the stated time. The remaining 11 predictions stretched out across the next 3 weeks, culminating in a final message that chilled Lena more than the rest combined. 18 days, 5 hours, magnitude 8.9, Cascadia. A full margin rupture, what civil engineers called the big one. According to the best statistical models, Cascadia produced a megathrust quake roughly every 250 to 500 years. The last was in 1700. The mean waiting time put the next one decades away. But the Earth, like an animal, does not keep polite appointment books. Thomas paced behind her, palms pressed to his temples so hard they left white blotches in his olive skin. "If this goes public, we'll look insane. If it happens, we're criminals for staying quiet." She zoomed in on the waveform, looking for some secret header of cosmic authority, some label typed by the planet in cat-scratch font that said, "Yes, mortal, you may trust this." Nothing of the sort presented itself. They decided to seek outside validation. Utedo Okafor, a Nigerian-Japanese expert on signal processing at Caltech, took their Zoom call. Lena emailed him sliced data sets, stripped of identifying metadata. If Hideo could reproduce the voices, the phenomenon gained legitimacy. If not, they'd found their error. Hideo phoned the next evening. "I don't know what you sent me," he said softly, as though the phone line were bugged. "It's real, though, not pareidolia. The voices carry formant structures consistent with human speech. I cross-checked timestamps against the Iris Aftershock catalog. Whoever is talking predicted 15 out of 15 events." "Could this be some elaborate cyber intrusion?" Thomas asked. "Maybe," Hideo said, "but you'd need to inject ghost frequencies at multiple sensors concurrently, keep latency sub-mixeddy, and predict geologic behavior perfectly. Easier to move Everest 10 feet than to hack that cleanly." Hideo cleared his throat. "The bigger question, who are the voices? Some of them resemble known voices in public data sets, 911 calls from past quakes. I recognized a woman who died in the Northridge collapse." Lena opened a browser, typed Northridge 911 last words, and immediately closed it. Gooseflesh climbed her arms. If the earth carried imprints of every trapped plea, every final phone call severed by falling debris, then the crust was a magnetic tape spinning beneath them, forever erasing and rewriting human terror. Sunday afternoon, Lena worked through archived subduction events dating back 30 years. Every one with a magnitude over 6 contained coded predictions of its own aftershocks. No scientist had looked for speech in ground motion. Nobody expected lexical order in chaos. The voices weren't new. She and Thomas were only the first to lower the playback speed enough to hear them. That night, the voices spoke directly to her again. "Lena, you will guide them." Then another layer beneath the first, male, older, stern. "Debt must be paid." She yanked the headphones off, yet the sentence seemed to linger in the air like the smell of burnt insulation. Debt? She phoned her mother half out of reflex, craving a voice that loved her without agenda. They spoke about trivial things. Garden soil, a cousin's wedding, until her mother said, "You're awfully quiet. Everything okay at work?" "Just busy, Mom," she whispered, staring at her reflection in the darkened monitor. "Just listening." Days barreled forward. Minor predictions kept proving correct, down to the second, down to the street corner. The media reported Lena's uncanny accuracy, though no outlet understood her source. She had begun feeding anonymous tips to city emergency managers, ensuring gas lines were shut off moments before they ruptured, dispatching inspectors to viaducts minutes before hairline cracks split wide enough to show sunlight. She became the invisible nerve threading through the city's crisis response system, a ghost of foresight. Thomas worried their fingerprints were everywhere. "Someone will demand the algorithm. We'll have to explain. We'll show them when we know more," Lena said, already thinking past explanation to obligation. If responsibility had a voice, it sounded like sedimental hiss inside her cochlea. 10 days before the predicted cataclysm, Lena started hearing the whispers without audio amplification. They flitted behind ordinary sounds. A vending machine whir, the sough of her shower. She feared the onset of a psychotic break. Yet the prediction stayed accurate, grounding madness in empirical truth. She scheduled an MRI anyway. The neurologist found nothing abnormal. 5 days out, the voices multiplied. Hallways at work seemed full of murmuring, though colleagues walked by in silence. The words were no longer timestamps. They were addresses, coordinates, instructions on how to pry open elevator doors, how to triage crush injuries with belt tourniquets. Someone or something was creating a disaster manual on the fly. Thomas confronted her in the parking lot. "You haven't slept," he said. "I can tell. Neither have you. Maybe we shouldn't." The pair submitted an emergency brief to the governor, couched in conventional seismic terms, a statistical clustering, a nonlinear moment release foreshadowing potential major rupture. It was enough to trigger a limited mobilization. National Guard units on standby, hospitals stocking burn kits, radio stations rehearsing civil defense scripts, but it was not enough to evacuate 4 million people from a metropolitan coastline. Lena didn't know which terrified her more, the possibility of forcing exodus on a false signal, or staying silent if the voices proved right. The evening before day 0, she found herself walking along the Green River levee. Salmon smolt flickered under the surface, ignorant of any approaching violence. Her phone buzzed. She answered. "Lena," the whisper said, no longer embedded in seismic files but on a regular voice call. Caller ID showed her own extension at the lab. "You will guide them." The whisper was hers, unmistakably her own voice, yet older, cracked by dust and distance. "When?" she asked aloud, throat raw. "Tomorrow, 8:17 and 39 seconds. Doc, begin with the school," the line cut. Far down the river, a dog barked, a long, mournful sound that seemed to carry the sorrow of drowned cities. At 6:45 a.m. the next morning, she and Thomas stood before the city emergency command staff. She handed them a list of coordinates and instructions: which bridges to close, where to pre-position ambulances, how many buses to divert toward inland high ground. She did not tell them the list had come from a phone call by her future self. Authority flowed from her credentials and the accuracy of her prior warnings. Nobody cared to examine its wellspring. 8:17 and 2 seconds. Donna squeezed her shoulder. 8:17 and 25 seconds. Somewhere, a transformer popped like distant fireworks. 8:17 and 39 seconds. The ground heaved upward, dropped, then side-shuffled in a motion so violent it blurred vision. Lena's ears filled with the low-frequency thunder of continents tearing. She ducked under the conference table as ceiling tiles avalanched. Glass partitions wavered like water before exploding. The quake lasted 132 seconds, an eternity by human reckoning, a sigh by geologic time. When the shaking stopped, sirens rose from every quadrant. Smoke columns striped the skyline. Cellular networks crashed into busy tones, but many of the city's brittle overpasses still stood thanks to overnight closures. Several schools had already evacuated onto playing fields. The downtown hospital ran on backup generators hoisted to new platforms days earlier. Tens of thousands were saved by directives nobody understood but followed anyway, because a soft-spoken seismologist with rimless glasses had said so. Aftershocks began 30 minutes later. The first voice arriving on the lab seismograph said, "North Tower trapped, 3 floors below roof." Lena patched the audio to rescue dispatch. Crews found 7 office workers pinned beneath collapsed HVAC units precisely where described. Another aftershock. Another message. Gas pocket 475890. N 1223340. W spark soon. Fire engines reached the address 10 minutes before the leak ignited. It became routine. Quake, whisper, rescue. Lena was no longer just predicting, she was translating, and the voices were no longer only the dead. Some were alive, speaking into collapsed stairwells, their words vibrating through concrete slabs into the bedrock, into the sensors, into her ears. A 5.9 aftershock rattled the already shredded downtown core. Amid the cacophony, a new message arrived, brittle and soft like a child's crayon snapping. "Listen deeper." She frowned. Deeper how? A coordinate followed, lat/long, pointing 20 miles south, where a decommissioned borehole sensor sat at the bottom of an experimental casing nearly 2 kilometers down. The site had gone offline after budget cuts. If the voices wanted to be heard deeper, that was where. She and Thomas commandeered an emergency jeep. Roads were buckled, traffic lights dead, but they reached the borehole by late afternoon. The control shed leaned but still stood. They powered up the ancient digitizer, patched in headphones, and waited. At first only static. Then, as though rising from a well, came a voice she knew as intimately as her own pulse. It was hers, older still. Rasp, stripped of moisture. "End of line," the future Lena whispered. "After the rain of fire, the ash will settle. Teach them to listen. The earth remembers everything." Thomas stared, white as driftwood. "That's you, Lena." Tears blurred the console lights. She understood in some nonlinear corner of her brain that consciousness might echo across pressures and minerals, the same way radio waved across ionosphere. The quake had knocked time askew, letting tomorrow's terror bleed backward into today. giving humanity a second hearing before the jury of fate. She pressed the mic button. What is the debt? Her future voice replied, nearly lost in the hiss. Not debt, consequence. Lightning snapped in distant hills. Thunder rolled a forewarning. Perhaps consequence was simply physics wearing a moral mask. She exhaled, wiped her eyes. How do we pay? By listening, the voice answered. And by teaching them to listen. The signal faded like chalk in rain. Silence filled the borehole shed, tender and absolute. That night, Lena drafted the curriculum for a new science, seismophonics, the study of voices, braided into ground motion. It would train operators to hear plea and prophecy alike, to translate grief into preparedness, to make nations hearken to the subterranean testimonies of their own citizens living and dead. Weeks later, as the city dredged itself from rubble and committees formed to praise miracles they scarcely grasped, Lena returned to her lab. She sat before an idle waveform window, headphones resting on her neck. Quiet, blessed quiet. But behind that quiet she sensed a murmur like surf inside a conch shell, a gathering of syllables still forming, waiting for a mind patient enough to catch them. She reached for the volume knob, hesitated, then turned it up.